Precolonial Black Africa by Cheikh Anta Diop. Chapter 5, Part 2. Appointments to the various offices in the traditional kingdoms entail the payment of a customary fee, not, however, necessarily to the king. Thus, among the Mosai, the keeper of the sand confirmed everyone in his respective office, including the king, by giving him, according to a religious ritual, a bit of sand from a hole specially prepared for this purpose. The appointee then had to reward him with something of value, varying with the importance of the office. Here once again we see this aspect of the African social structure, this aspect of the caste system. Material wealth often bypassed the chiefs and notables to pass into the hands of men of the caste, skilled workers. No comparison with the feudal system in which the lord kept everything. Later on, with the profanation of the royal office, its secularization, this fee would return to the king. Thus, in Songhai, at the time of the conflict with Morocco, a fandoko upon appointment was required to turn over 2,000 cows. Government and administration. Hostages. All the sovereigns of the Sudan found it politically and administratively wise to exact of the children of their vassals a variable term of service in the palace. Some of these young princes remained there all their lives as a sort of pages, obviously treated according to their rank, while others returned to their respective provinces after a number of years spent as hostages. Sadi remarked that this custom lasted from the time of Mali until his own day, and was general throughout the Sudan. Thus, Ali Kolon, the future Sunni Ali, was first hostage of the Mansa of Mali at the time his homeland, Songhai, was a vassal of Mali. It is known that despite the precautions taken by his father's suzerain, he had to make good his escape so as to found the true kingdom of Kyoga, whose borders before his accession did not extend beyond the suburbs of that city. The plan nurtured and executed by Sunni Ali proves, if proof were needed, that the measures taken by the Sudanese kings were not necessary. During this period of raising the sons of their vassals, they hoped to bring them to share their own ideas, to get them to identify closely with the interests of the kingdom, so that they would no longer feel themselves strangers obligated to fight against them out of a filial devotion. This was the far-sighted pursuit of a policy of strengthening the bonds between the various provinces and the cradle of the realm. An effort at integration after the annexation of a province. In exactly the same way, in an earlier period, the Egyptian pharaohs acted toward the sons of Asiatic princes, who were their vassals from the time of the 18th dynasty onward, after the conquest of Thutmose III. This process of assimilation was thus not the least of the factors in the African governmental and administrative methods. Songhai. The generals in Songhai were not necessarily slaves. They could be men of any class, likewise the civil servants. The career of El Amin eloquently illustrates this fact. Under the Askia Mohammed, he was only a simple hostler, a member of the royal cortege, one of those who, in turn, were called upon to saddle the king's horse. Askia Ismail promoted him to chief of pedestrians, or route master. He pursued these duties until Askia Daoud came to power, when the latter made him a Jian Manzo, or chief of the city of Degen, rising from the position of hostler to that of governor of one of the largest trading cities in the empire, can truly be called coming up in the world. The previously established barriers within the caste system by division of labor had now partially given way. We get the impression that one could therefore aspire to any position, made possible by luck, intrigue, and merit. It must be remembered that the founder of the Askia dynasty, called Muhammad the Great, the Believer Prince, was only a lieutenant of Sunni Ali, who usurped the throne after defeating his son Bekir Dao, March 3rd, 1493. One important notion would seem to have vanished, that of legitimacy. Any victorious leader is legitimate, as the facts prove. The numerous coups d'états throughout the history of Shanghai. The people immediately recognized his authority. They held no rancor toward him. A royal branch was thus born and developed from a very lowly common stock. At the end of one generation, it had acquired almost the same prestige as the other already existing royal families. We thus witness the parallel development of several dynasties, rivals insofar as they are confined to certain relatively distinct families, a situation exactly identical to the one in Cayor in the 17th century, which may have been inherited from Shanghai. The existence of the Kharijite sect of Islam may not be unconnected to this state of affairs. This sect is characterized by its refusal to recognize any supreme authority for all Islam, any caliph, any sort of Muslim pope, and by the fact that any believer, however modest his social origins, might be elevated to the rank of king if he otherwise possesses the requisite qualities. Sunni Ali nominally belonged to this sect. Various ministries. The hierarchy of offices in Shanghai was inflexible. The country was divided into provinces, cantons, villages, large cities of commercial character such as Degen and Timbuktu, border areas which were strongholds such as the Taghiza, Ualata, Nima, etc. A sultan or farai governed certain provinces, as might a shah. There was the Dendi farai, the Karmina farai, the Kalacha. A farba, a manzo, or a koi governed cities of different types and their immediate environs. There was the Timbuktu koi, the High koi, the Derma koi, the Hambori koi, etc. The governor of the Ualata border area, with its dependencies, was a farber in the days of Mali. The equivalent term for farba in Shanghai was farma. The border area of Taghiza on the tropic was governed by a manzo. The balama was a kind of supply officer. The title itself was older than that of Askia, according to Kati. The Asara Mundio was a kind of police commissioner, viz. The Asaria Mundio of the city of Degen or the city of Timbuktu. The Anfara Kuma was the traditional judge in pre-Islamic times. It was a hereditary office always held by members of the Kuma clan. They were Anfaras or judges, whence the term Anfara Kuma, which came to mean the Kadi in Shanghai. Kati insists on the point that this is the inevitable adaptation of the traditional expression for an equivalent Arabic term after Islamization. The Khan Farai, or Kumina Farai, was a new office created by Askia Muhammad and occupied for the first time by his own brother, Amar Kam Diago, who was Tandi Farma under Ali Bur. It corresponded to a veritable vice-regency with Tenderma as its capital. The Tungkoi, Quran, and Soora were subaltern military positions that might exist in a city such as Degen. The Degen Khoi, Banai Khoi, and Kora Khoi were administrative and military chiefs of cities and regions. They thus had under their command a territorial guard. The Guimi Khoi, or Gumei Khoi, was the port director. The Hai Khoi was responsible for ships and smaller craft. The Yobu Khoi was in charge of the markets. The Gari Taya repaired saddles. The Berbuchi Mundio, or Manzo, was the administrator in charge of affairs concerning the Barabic Arabs. The Koira Banda Mundio was a suburban administrator of a city. The Bari Khoi was the chief of etiquette and protocol. The Uani Farma was the minister of property. The Seo Farma was the superintendent of forest. The Lari Farma was the superintendent of waterways. The Kore Farma was in charge of affairs concerning the white minorities inhabiting the country. The Tara Farmer was the cavalry chief. The Tari Mundio was the inspector of agriculture. Certain offices could be held at the same time. One might be a Fari Manzo. The Fari was above the Khoi. The High Khoi, Ali Dudu, provisionally named Dendi Farai, was obliged to go back to his old seat in the assembly when he lost this title, as we have already seen. But the Khoi was above the Cha. We have observed that the naming a Kala Cha to the post of Khoi corresponded to a promotion. We will not repeat the description of official insignia and uniforms connected with these offices. The identity of the terms designating the administrative offices of Western Sudan would give evidence, if this were needed, of the earlier administrative unification of this region. Administrative unity. Delafosse pointed out that in many parts of the Sudan the following terms were and still are in use: Farai, Farima, Farhama, Fama, Mandi, Faran, Songhai, Farah, Hausa, Farba, Wolof, all of which may derive from the root Far, meaning summit, apex, chief, prince, from which also derives the title of the pharaohs. In Wolof, in fact, there exists beside the term Farba that of Farai, which is an imperial epithet, Bur, meaning king, Bur Farai, meaning the supreme king, the emperor, the one whose power and greatness cannot be surpassed. The Egyptian term is not etymologically what Delafosse suggests. It is formed from the plural of per, the wall of the house, and by extension the house of the pharaoh. The meaning of per in modern Wolof is identical to that of per in ancient Egyptian. In Wolof, words beginning with P form their plurals by alteration to F. Pil, B, the pil, Feel ye the pules, per me the wall, fur ye the walls, whence farai. We recall that if Pharaoh was derived from the Egyptian plural of per, it was because the king was customarily identified with the name of his house, which was a double house. Would this then suggest that the creators of the first West African states recollected an earlier political organization which, by way of Nubia, leads us back to Egypt? The ubiquity of this term in all African languages, the etymological explanations that can be offered leave little room for doubt. If that were the case, a new light would be shed on this initial period of African history. It would no longer be a question of an absolute beginning, but rather of a continuation following emigration. There would then be nothing surprising in these monarchies being constitutional from the start. Their originators, instead of being creators ex nihilo, would have had the benefit of an earlier political experience. Thus, it would be equally comprehensible that the forms of socio-political organization of the African states were related only to those of Pharaonic Egypt and could finally be understood only in terms of them. No insurmountable objections are raised by supposing it would be materially impossible to govern an empire the size of Europe or administer it without a minimum of bureaucracy. It is difficult to realize that for 1500 years the Tankas, Mansas, and Askias simply issued verbal orders and got verbal accounts and reports in return. The custom activities of the border areas, based on what we have just said, would presuppose some kind of precise accounting, just as the payment of taxes and other fees would seem to imply the issuing of receipts, especially to the peripatetic merchants at the markets of Timbuktu, Dijen, etc. The same held true with regard to relations of all sorts between the central authority and the various provinces, to allow administrative coordination. We shall see in Chapter 7 that writing had already long been part of daily life, and that intellectual activity had reached a level barely conjecturable today. Epistolary correspondence was common. When Askia Musa came to power, he wrote 2 letters, one to his brother Atsman, the other to the latter's mother, so as to avoid any eventual conflict. The Askias, who thus carried on private correspondence, did as much on the administrative and political levels. Sadi and Kadi allow us to be sure of it. The concept of documentation and records clearly existed in the people's consciousness. The author of the Tariq-es-Sudan stresses that he saw the original of the document addressed by the Sultan of Morocco to Askia Ishak II concerning the salt mines of Tegiza. It was customary to accompany these missives with some token of authenticity. They did not bear an inimitable seal. Thus, when the Timbuktu Khoi decided to open the gates of his city to Sani Ali, he made sure to send one of its boots with the messenger so that Sani Ali might have proof positive of the authenticity and sincerity of the mission. The existence of African archives will be confirmed by further data when we discuss education and child rearing. Military organization. In mentioning above the numbers of men in the armies of Ghana and Songhai, We showed only the size of the imperial forces. The time has come to analyze the structure of these armies, their components, their weapons, their strategy, and even their tactics. Structure. In Malai and Songhai, we know for certain the king who appointed the generals was himself the commander-in-chief of the army and personally directed military operations, as would later the Dorobi Damels of Cayor. The Tariq-es-Sudan points out that Askia el-Hajj was never able to undertake an expedition during his entire reign because at the time of his accession he contracted a disease that kept him from riding a horse. He was an exception, in sharp contrast to all the other Askias. In each kingdom, each nation, the army was divided into several corps, assigned to the defense of different provinces, although under command of the civil authority. Thus, each provincial governor had at his disposal a part of this army to which he could assign tasks under the orders of a general whose powers were purely military. On the lower level, below the king, in political or administrative affairs, the distinction between civil and military powers was thus very clear. The king of Malai, when he conquered Songhai, Timbuktu, Zaga, Mima, the Baghina, and the environs of that region, as far as the Atlantic Ocean, had two generals under his command. One was responsible for the defense of the southern part of the empire, on the Maasai border, the other of the northern part at the edge of the desert. Their respective names were Sankar Zuma and Faran Sura. These were the titles corresponding to their military functions. Each of them had under his command a certain number of officers and troops. The western borders of the state of Djen, before the conquest of the city by Sunni Ali, were defended by the commanders of 12 army corps deployed in the country of Sana. They were specifically assigned to surveillance of the movements of Malai. The Sana Faran was their general-in-chief. We even know the family names of some of the officers under his orders: Yaosuro, Sayasoro, Mat Ego, Karamu, etc. Likewise, 12 commanders of army corps were assigned to the east of the Niger toward Tetilai. Among the Maasai, the Moro Naba, whom tradition prohibited from leaving his capital, could not personally direct military expeditions. As a result, this became the task of the active generals. The Maasai conscripted everyone. When the danger had passed, each citizen returned to his home, his village. The army was then demobilized except for a few security units. In Songhai, beginning with the reign of Askia Muhammad, a distinction began being made between the people and the army. Instead of mass conscription, a permanent army was created. Civilians who were not part of it could go about their business. During the reign of Sunni Ali, all able-bodied nationals were subject to enlistment. The major divisions of the army were knights, cavalry, foot soldiers, auxiliary bodies of Tuaregs, elite infantry regiments, the royal guard, and armed flotilla. Knights. The princes of Black Africa, who could afford to outfit themselves in complete or partial armor like that of the knights of the Western Middle Ages. After the accession of Askia el-Hajj, the Kormina Farai el-Hajj, on February 13, 1584, started a revolt with intent to seize power, but he failed. The Askia, who was well informed, made him take off the flowing bulbul he was wearing. Beneath he wore a coat of mail. When Balama Mohammed es Sadiq revolted against Askia Mohammed Bano, and in March 1588 attempted to march on Kyoga, the Askia who came forth to challenge him to battle wore an iron breastplate. As it was extremely hot, and the Askia was very fat, he died of the effects of his armor. The rebellious Balama wore an iron helmet. When Omar Kato threw a javelin at his head, it ricocheted off the helmet. Another Sultan of Morocco, Moulay Ahmed, in December 1589, January 1590, renewed the request made by one of his predecessors about the mines of the Tegheza. Ishak II, who was then Askia, reacted violently, and as a sign of defiance and a show of force, sent the Sultan an offensive letter, some javelins, and 2 iron boots. Complete knight's armor was thus in use, as if we have seen. Coat of mail, an iron breastplate, helmet, boots, javelin, all of it. The African princes of Songhai were armed as knights. This practice was certainly not as widespread as in Europe, if only because of the climate, as shown by the death of Askia Bano, who died of suffocation. The explorer Barth saw such knights in the kingdom of Bornu in more recent times, about 1850. It is likely that such armor came from Europe, as did certain fabrics, but no documents exist to prove it. It might have come into Africa from Spain. We may suppose that African blacksmiths made replicas from these models, better adapted to the climate, which could be worn either inside or outside clothing. The use of iron armor was common in Benin, the subjects appearing on the bronzes of the time as decoration were in the first instance real armor. Cavalry. All other mounted soldiers of more modest birth and fortune formed the cavalry. They were armed with shields and javelins. The cavalry was terrifyingly powerful, if we judge by the panic that the clashing of its weapons caused in the Moroccan ranks during the war against Morocco, June 1609. What frightened the Moroccans most in this encounter was the noise of the shields pounding against the legs of the horses when they were galloping. The entire Moroccan army, chiefs and soldiers, fled as far as Lake Deba, where the men were thigh-deep in water, but having recognized the cause of their terror, they left the water after having experienced the greatest terror and the most extreme fear. Foot soldiers. Foot soldiers were armed mainly with bows and arrows. The infantry included a special elite corps, which was distinguished by the wearing of gold bracelets. Whatever the fortunes of war, the members of this elite corps could not turn their backs on the enemy, which is what happened at the end of the first battle that de jure, under orders of the Sultan of Morocco, fought against Askia Daoud on the left bank of the Niger River. The army of Songhai was defeated because it had no firearms. The whole elite corps allowed itself to be decapitated rather than run away. There also perished that day a large number of important people among the foot soldiers. When the army was defeated, they threw their shields on the ground and squatted on these sorts of seats, awaiting the arrival of de jure's troops, who massacred them in this position without any resistance on their part. This because they were not to flee in case of rout. The Moroccan soldiers took the gold bracelets from their arms. The army had a band consisting of drums, trumpets, and cymbals. When El Hajj revolted, he marched on Cayuga to the sound of such trumpets. He had put on a breastplate and let the trumpeters, drummers, and so on march ahead of him. The war drum of the Damel of Cayor was called the Jungjung. It was used to beat out the Bur Daka Djap Rendi, a march signifying the king follows the enemy, catches him, kills him. The auxiliary corps of the Tuareg vassals were composed essentially of camel drivers. There must also have been infantry armed with long javelins, marching ahead of the camels and fighting according to the Berber technique, as described by Bakri. The Tuaregs wore puffed trousers, a tunic, a turban, and a litham. Flotilla. There existed on the Niger an entire flotilla, no doubt composed of small boats equipped with outrigging, hence uncapsizable, like those found today on Lake Chad, Lake Victoria, and other large lakes of Central Africa. In case of war, this fleet was used for military purposes. The director of the port of Timbuktu, or some other place where the battle took place, then played a leading role. At the time of the war against Morocco, he was to hide the boats so Moroccan soldiers could not cross the river. Mahmud, leader of the Moroccan army, then decided to march against Askia Ishak. First of all, he set about procuring boats, since the director of the port, Manzo el Fa uld Zerka, had taken them all with him at the time of his flight toward Benka, when Askia Ishak had demanded the evacuation of the city of Timbuktu. Those were the different corps that made up the African army of Songhai. They lacked one essential weapon: firearms. They did not have the time to acquire any because the very people who might have sold them to them, either manufacturers, Europeans, or intermediaries, Arabs, took advantage of this major weakness to try to conquer Black Africa. The first firearms sold to the Africans exploded in their hands. Royal Guard. The king was surrounded by a very large body of guards in which the sons of vassal princes served side by side with other members of the nobility. Within this army, in which a lordly, aristocratic mentality reigned, the role of the griot assumed all its sociological significance. Through his songs, which were living accounts of the history of the country in general, and the families whose members he addressed, he helped, he even forced the indecisive, fearful warrior to act bravely, and the brave to act like heroes, to perform miracles. His contribution to victory was very important. His bravery and often temerity were beyond question, for he too was as exposed to danger as the warriors whose exploits he celebrated. Even at the height of battle, they needed to hear his exhortations, which boosted their morale. The griots then were not superfluous beings. The usefulness was obvious. They had a Homeric social function to fulfill. The division of labor was thus valid at all levels of society. European conquest dimmed the interest to be found in the character of the griot, but it is impossible to give an historical account of the mentality of pre-colonial African armies without assessing his part in it. To a certain extent, he even held the fate of the princes in his hands. After having been lectured by his mother, Otsman had given up all idea of revolt and was once again determined to obey his brother, who had become Askia Daoud. He even loaded some boats with food to go and do him homage at the head of his troops. But the feelings of pride awakened by the song of his griot, as he was setting forth, were stronger than his sense of discipline. He no longer deemed it necessary to rub dust on his head as a sign of obeisance to anyone. But almost immediately, as his griot began to sing, he went into such a fury that he almost burst with rage and addressed his entourage, crying out, "Unload everything on the boats. Upon my life, the one speaking to you will no longer put any dust on his head for anyone." Strategy and tactics. Strategy and tactics were quite different from one country to another. There were different ways of combining the attacks of cavalry and infantry. The use of scouts and encampments with tents was common. Friday, the 18th of the month of Jamoda, 1st, April 15th, 1588. Balama Mohammed S. Sadiq camped with his troops at Kambo Korai. After his tent was put up, the Balama went inside, and the first person who came to attack them was Marenfa el Hajj. The Askia Daoud also camped before the walls of Timbuktu. On his return, Askia Daoud passed through the Timbuktu and camped in this city, in the square behind the mosque. They carried on long sieges, lasting for years, with consummate technique, in no way less expert than that of Agamemnon before Troy. This was the case in the siege of the city of the Jinn by Sunni Ali. The cities were fortified by a system of ramparts, with a variable number of guarded gates. A fortified city was called a Tata. The Jinn is surrounded by a rampart with 11 gates. 3 of them were later sealed, so that only 8 remain today. To conquer a city thus fortified, which never before had been subjugated, if we are to believe the Tariq-es-Sudan, Sunni Ali laid a siege which lasted 7 years and some months. His camp was set up at Zoboro, former site of the city. He left there each day to fight before the walls until evening. These battle scenes took place daily throughout the entire low water season. When the water rose surrounding the walls of the city, making it unapproachable, he withdrew with his troops to the place which today bears his name, Nibkatu Sunni, or Sunny's Hill. While waiting for the water to recede, the troops cultivated the soil to produce their own food. Things continued in this way until, at the end of 7 years, the Jinn surrendered, chiefly for lack of supplies. During that time, the king had died and his young son had replaced him. Sunni Ali treated the latter benevolently and married his mother. After his death, The city of the Jinn was to keep his horse's trappings in a kind of museum as relics. According to Kati, however, the siege lasted only about 6 months, with some battles at night. The Jinn was blocked, he reports, by 400 warships. Since Sunni Ali reigned for only 27 years, the duration of the siege indicated by Sadi does appear excessive. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere between these two extremes, 6 months and 7 years. Further research will enable us to come closer to the historical truth. The effects of surprise and secret missions were in common use. On August 21st, 1563, Askia Daoud ordered the Farai Manzo Bokar to go and fight Bani, a rebel chief in Barca land. Bani was very clever and had in the past given much trouble to the central power. The Askia resolved to keep secret the mission with which he had entrusted the Farai Manzo. The most unfavorable time of year for such a maneuver was chosen, so as to overcome the vigilance of Bani, who could never have suspected that so many obstacles would be faced in order to reach him. The direction of the march also was unlikely. Troops would go up into the mountains, from which they would then pour down, to the great surprise of the enemy, who at most might have expected to see them lining up on the usual horizon. The Farai's troops were kept completely ignorant of the goal and destination of the operation. Even the Askia's son, who was along on the expedition, was unable to learn the secret known only to the general, the Farai Manzo. Thus, Bani was defeated. Military demonstrations were also used. Askia Daoud, for one, deployed his forces as far as Masai and Lulamai country without engaging in battle or pillaging, for the sole purpose of impressing his neighbors and taking away any desire they might have to venture into the interior of his lands. The Tariq el-Fatah also stresses the development of military science in Songhai. Its author underlines the difficulties of the Cormina Farai's expedition against Tanida, Tengela Tia Indela, king of Futa. Tenderma, the point of departure, was 2 months' march away. Even so, the expedition was victoriously completed with a large army. The defeated army was put to death, and the troops returned with a great deal of booty. March 8th, 1513. Although the Cairians were formidable warriors, their military tactics, until the accession of Lat Dior, seem not to have been so well regulated as in Songhai. The knights charged in total anarchy, each one whenever he felt like it. After having gotten carefully plastered far in the rear, they felt that their noble station was incompatible with the idea of an organized command, especially when it was headed by a slave generalissimo, the Dairaf Buntker. The fact was that they often arranged to let the foot soldiers take the first rounds of fire, the only ones that usually were fatal. The firearms the Cairians had at the end of the Damel period were loaded with powder, pottery shards, and other small fragments of cast iron. It is easy to imagine that during a battle, the soldiers did not often have time to replace such loads. So after the first rounds, which followed was nothing but fireworks, causing at most slight superficial burns. More than one brave knight chose such a moment to enter the fray, seeking out among the enemy knights a single personal adversary he might defeat. He fired his gun only when in sight of this enemy. He had sworn to do so on the eve of battle at the time of the Khas. This was a ritual often held at night, in which all the valiant warriors, plunging their lances repeatedly into a pile of sand that they had surrounded, proclaimed their intended exploits for the next day. It was Lat Dior who probably introduced mobile war into Cairo. Before the technical superiority of Fade Herb's armies, the Damel, who had accepted the teachings of the French school, knew how to adapt to the situation. Instead of putting forward the bulk of his army, he divided it into small corps, posted at strategic points. So it was a war of harassment, a guerrilla war he waged against Fade Herb. His men even dug individual holes in the ground, fully covered, with just one opening through which to aim a weapon. A surprise salvo thus greeted the arrival of the enemy on the scene. This was the tactic called guerjo, individual hole. This period of mobile war was called the time of the whirling. Lat Dior stalked Fade Herb's troops, who were stalking his, so people wondered, with a touch of mockery, who was chasing whom. Judicial organization. In the traditional empire, justice was inseparable from religion. It was a compensatory punishment, ritually administered to one who offended against social order. With Islamization, the situation became more complex. It became more and more secular, although its foundation remained religious to the extent that the Quran was everywhere adapted as the civil code, Ghana, Malai, Songhai. However, there had always been throughout history two types of justice: royal justice and the justice of the Qadi. The Qadi was the Muslim judge appointed by the king. He handled mainly common law misdemeanors, disputes between citizens or between citizens and foreigners. These were the sorts of cases under the jurisdiction of the Qadi of Ghana or Timbuktu. A tribunal was built for rendering justice. In Ghana, the procedures employed to make the accused confess were quite rudimentary. In cases of murder or other crimes or debts, the provost used the ordeal by water. The accused was brought before him rather than the king. A tribunal was built for the rendering of justice. The ordeal by water consisted of steeping a piece of special wood in a given quantity of water, which the accused was then made to drink. If he vomited this bitter brew, he was innocent. The ordeal by water was only a variant of the ordeal by fire practiced until present times in Black Africa, although prohibited by French law. The most recent case I know of occurred around 1936. It was at Diourbel in Senegal, in the Baol. It consisted of heating till it was white hot a thin metal blade, usually a sort of old spike polished in earth, which each of the accused in turn had to lick. The guilty ones were those who had swollen or split tongues the following day. Truly a barbarous method, in every way comparable to those employed in the Middle Ages, mainly in the Germanic judicial system. The guilty, of course, sometimes confessed in time, but how many of the innocent must have been victims. The most extraordinary fact about it is that several defendants undeniably underwent this ordeal with success. This can be explained only by a large dose of self-suggestion, due to the mystical religious conviction widespread among the common people, according to which the innocent could not be burned. One can imagine the terrible result that might occur when an innocent defendant of skeptical temperament was involved. With the influx of merchants to Timbuktu and the development of the city's international character, it was eventually found necessary to name another judge besides the Qadi, of a clearly more profane character, qualified exclusively to settle disputes between foreigners or between foreigners and locals. One of them, temporarily appointed, was Mohammed Bag Hoyle, a man of Wankore origin, under Askia el-Hajj. The Qadi's intellectual level was very high, their sense of duty very acute. One fact concerning the reign of Askia Ishak proves this. The Askia twice in vain offered the position of Qadi to the jurist Abu Hafs Omar, who refused it. Another jurist, Takoni, advised the Askia to threaten Abu Hafs that he would appoint an ignorant man to the position, in which case, having so obstinately refused this office, Abu Hafs would be responsible before God for the incompetence of all the judicial acts rendered. Only when reduced to this extreme did he accept and take office on February 1st, 1585. A judge's house and a mosque were inviolable sanctuaries. The Qadi could with impunity admonish the king to the princes. He was the respected intercessor whose words were heeded. When Said Mara was banished from society by Askia el-Hajj, he got as far as the mosque, where he took refuge, implored, and obtained the intercession of the Qadi with the sovereign, and was granted a pardon. A public crier announced the decisions of the Qadi or the king, when they affected the population at large. Common punishments were incarceration. There were prisons at Kainato, at Kabara near Timbuktu, and elsewhere. Confiscation of goods and bastinado, which might accidentally prove fatal. El-Hajj's maternal uncle, who had organized a revolt against the Askia in favor of his nephew, died in this manner. Crimes of lèse-majesté and high treason were under the jurisdiction of the king. Thus Askia el-Hajj insisted on himself judging all those who had participated in the conspiracy aimed at toppling him from the throne. The punishments he inflicted on the guilty, as he himself pointed out, were based on the degree of their involvement in the revolt and the rank of their social positions. The same was true under Askia Ishak II, who condemned the Hamborai Khoi to be sewn alive into a bull's hide and buried in this way. With Askia el-Hajj, we see how royal justice banned a person from society. Said Mara was to be led throughout the city, while a crier announced his outlawry. This meant that anyone could henceforth kill him with impunity, since no law any longer protected his life. It was while he was being turned over to the mob that he took refuge in the mosque under the protection of the imam. In Masar land, the Nakomse nobles could be judged only by their peers, so to speak. The moral Naba alone was qualified to do this. When the king was on his throne to render justice in any part of Africa, he was the only one allowed to wear headgear, the symbol of dignity and wisdom. The Pharaoh of Egypt, in the same position, was referred to as the Etef. Although Egyptologists have been unable to find an exact term to translate this word, if Ate was a revised Egyptian verb, Atef would signify in Egyptian, he judges, assuming that this root meant to judge. It is interesting to note that Atef and Wolof means let one judge. Despite their very great importance, the Qadis were dependent on the king, whereas the Tariq as-Sudan gives us to understand that the one of Timbuktu was the most important of all, that all others were subordinate to him, and he could remove them. The Tariq al-Fataq is more categorical. It was Askia Muhammad who appointed all the Qadis of his kingdom. Thus, it was that he appointed a Qadi at Timbuktu, a Qadi in the city of Djinn, and a Qadi in each city of his territory which had one, from the Kanta to the Sibir Dugu. The use of notarized documents was widespread. The author of the Tariq as-Sudan, for example, was asked to draw up a notarized inventory of the goods belonging to a convict, one Salti, when he went to prison during the war with Morocco. Tuesday, when we entered the prison, we found the unfortunate Salti in a pitiful state. I read him the register of the inventory, and as he declared that this was indeed his entire fortune, we attested to it in writing on the register to vouch for its authenticity. The author was accompanied by another notary. Ibn Battuta described the spirit of imminent justice in the people and the security which covered foreigners and their goods, two facts worthy of a society already open to international affairs. Acts of injustice are rare among them. Of all the peoples, they are the one least inclined to commit any, and the Sultan, Black King, never pardons anyone who is found guilty of them. Over the whole of the country there reigns perfect security. One can live and travel there without fear of theft or rapine. They do not confiscate the goods of white men who die in their country. Even though they may be of immense value, they do not touch them. On the contrary, they find trustees for the legacy among white men and leave it in their hands until the rightful beneficiaries come to claim it. So wrote Battuta in 1352-1353, at the time of the 100 Years' War, relating the good he found in the behavior of the blacks. In certain holy cities dominated by the clergy, such as Timbuktu, Dayaba in Malai, Kundi Oro in Diara, the Qadi had the right of pardon or punishment, life and death, over the accused. If Kati is to be believed, the Mansa of Mali could not enter the sacred city of Diaba even if the murder of his son had taken refuge there, because it was the city of God, where salvation was guaranteed to all fugitives. Such must have been the case of Ndiari, the holy city of the Nda in Senegal. Judges must often have been unpopular for quite human reason. That explains the numerous refusals of appointments related by Kati and Sarai. End of chapter 5.